My name is Cora Shaw. Before the silence, my world was painted in the soft hues of watercolor and the precise, delicate lines of ink. I am a botanical illustrator, a profession that demands patience and a quiet eye. I find solace in the intricate veining of a leaf, the subtle blush of a petal, the patient unfurling of a fern. I live in Port Blossom, a small coastal city that smells of salt and rain, where the mist rolls in from the Pacific each morning to kiss the cedar and pine trees that crowd the hillsides. My life, like my art, was one of quiet observation, of finding beauty in the details. My mother, a landscape architect with a wild heart and hands that were always covered in soil, was the one who taught me to see. "Look closer, Cora," she'd say, pointing to the fractal patterns in a head of Romanesco broccoli or the spiral of a seashell. "The universe is whispering its secrets everywhere." She passed away a year ago, leaving behind a void that felt as vast and gray as the ocean on a winter's day. She also left me her legacy: the Saltwood House, a lovely old craftsman perched on a bluff overlooking the water, and a comfortable nest egg, her way of ensuring I would always have the freedom to create without worry. It was a gift I held sacred, a trust one couldn't yet bring myself to touch, for it felt too much like the final closing of a door. My husband, Daniel, had been my anchor through that storm of grief. We met in a downtown cafe where I was sketching the wilting tulips on the tables. He leaned over my shoulder, his voice a low, warm hum. "You see things other people miss," he'd said. He was a financial advisor, a man of numbers and certainties, and I, a woman of colors and questions. We seemed to complete each other. He was the sturdy trunk, and I was the climbing vine. In the early days of our marriage, he would trace the lines of my drawings with his fingertip, his admiration a gentle warmth that made me feel seen, truly seen. He was my rock, my safe harbor, the man I believed would stand by me through any tide. But a tide did come, one I never saw forming on the horizon. It began with a sudden, unseasonal downpour. The cobblestone streets of the old market district, slick and treacherous, glistened under the street lamps. I was carrying a portfolio of new prints, my mind on the sea green I would use for a new series on coastal algae. A car, taking a corner too fast, sent a spray of icy water over the pavement. I flinched, my heel skidded, and the world tilted sideways. My head met the stone curb with a sickening, final thud. And then, there was nothing. Not the scream that I felt rip from my throat, not the screech of tires, not the concerned shouts of passers-by. Just a vast, profound, and terrifying silence. I woke in a hospital room that felt like a bell jar. The light was painfully bright, but the world was muted, sealed off. I saw Daniel's face, etched with worry, his mouth moving, forming my name. I could see the shape of the word Cora, but I couldn't hear it. The sound had been stolen, leaving a vacuum in its place. The doctors, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and clinical detachment, called it severe sensorineural hearing loss, a result of the trauma. They spoke of possibilities, of weeks or months, of therapies, of the chance it might be permanent. Daniel held my hand, his grip tight, and used a notepad to translate their cautious words. "I'm here," he wrote, his handwriting a familiar comfort. "We'll get through this. I love you." I clung to those words, to his presence, as if to a life raft in a silent, shoreless sea. For the first few weeks, he was the man I had married. He downloaded transcription apps, learned a few basic signs, and left little notes around the house, tucked into my teacup or propped against my sketchbook. He was patient when I struggled to read his lips, his smile encouraging when I grew frustrated. I watched his face, studying the subtle cues of his expressions, learning a new language of love written in the curve of a lip and the furrow of a brow. I told myself that this was just another storm, and he was my anchor, holding fast. But anchors can drag. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the foundation began to shift. The notes became less frequent, then stopped altogether. The transcription app on his phone went unused, a forgotten icon on his home screen. He started speaking to me with his back turned, his words lost before they could even be formed on his lips. When I would gently touch his arm to get his attention, a flicker of irritation would cross his face before being quickly masked by a sigh and a tired smile. It was the smile that hurt the most. It was a polite, thin-lipped gesture that didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile one gives a stranger, not a wife. I began to feel like a ghost in my own home, a silent observer of a life that was moving on without me. One evening, I walked into the living room and found him on the phone. He was pacing by the large bay window, the fading light of the sunset casting him in silhouette. He hadn't seen me. He was laughing, a deep, genuine laugh that I couldn't hear but could feel. It vibrated in the floorboards. His whole body was alive with it, his shoulders relaxed, his head thrown back. It was a joy I hadn't seen in him for weeks. When he finally turned and our eyes met, he startled. The laughter died in his throat, the light in his eyes extinguished. His mouth formed the words, "Oh, just a work call." But his body told a different story. He looked like a man caught in a moment of freedom he wasn't supposed to have. It was then I started my journal. Not a diary of feelings, but a logbook of observations. As an illustrator, my power had always been in my sight, and now it was all I had. I started documenting the small, unsettling details. Tuesday, Daniel came home late. Said he was at a client dinner. His shirt smelled faintly of a perfume that wasn't mine, something floral and sharp, like gardenias. Friday, he sat in his car in the driveway for 15 minutes after getting home, talking on his phone. He was smiling that same, real smile. He didn't see me watching from the upstairs window. Sunday, he called me by another woman's name while he was texting. A slip of the tongue. Sophie. He didn't even notice he'd done it. Sophie. The name was a cold stone in my stomach. His ex-girlfriend from before we met. The one he'd always described as a lot of fun, but too much drama. He'd sworn she was a closed chapter. Now her name hung in the silent air between us. Each entry was a small cut, a tiny wound that stung with the salt of my unspoken grief. I was losing him. Or perhaps I had already lost him, and the silence had just made me finally open my eyes and see it. Then his mother arrived. Margaret swept into our home like a brisk, cold front, all sharp angles and expensive perfume. She kissed the air beside my cheek and handed me a bouquet of lilies, their funereal scent filling the entryway. She was a woman who wore her disapproval like a tailored blazer, impeccably cut and always present. "Darling," she said to Daniel, completely ignoring me after the initial greeting. To her, I was no longer a person to be engaged with, but a problem to be managed. She would sit in the living room, sipping her tea, and talk at me, her voice a low murmur I couldn't hear, but her lips forming words I could piece together with painstaking focus. She made no effort to face me, to ensure I could understand. She didn't care if I did. She assumed I couldn't. "It's such a burden on him, you know," I read from her lips one afternoon as she spoke to a friend on the phone, glancing at me where I sat with a book. "He's a saint, really. Tying his future to it's a tragedy." She smiled at me when she hung up, a perfectly arranged, fragile thing with no warmth behind it. My journal entries grew darker, filled with the poison she dripped into our home. The house, once my sanctuary, began to feel like a cage. Daniel and Margaret would have long, hushed conversations in his study with the door closed. I would see them through the crack, their faces animated, gesturing toward a stack of papers on the desk. One night, I saw a familiar letterhead, the name of my mother's solicitor. My blood ran cold. They were talking about my inheritance. They were talking about the Saltwood house. They thought my silence was a sign of weakness, of helplessness. They didn't realize that in the quiet, my other senses had sharpened. I was watching. I was learning. I was no longer the climbing vine. I was becoming something else entirely, something with roots of its own, gathering strength in the dark, silent earth. The day the world came rushing back, it began not with a bang, but with a whisper. I was in the garden, my sanctuary within a sanctuary, trimming the lavender bushes my mother had planted years ago. The scent was a calming balm. I felt a strange, ticklish vibration in my right ear, like a moth beating its wings. I ignored it at first, a phantom sensation. But then it came again, followed by a faint, high-pitched ringing. I dropped the shears. I stood perfectly still, holding my breath. And then I heard it. The timid chirp of a sparrow in the cedar tree above me. Tears streamed down my face, hot and silent. The sound was a miracle, a gift I hadn't dared to hope for. It was thin, tinny, like listening through a wall, but it was there. Over the next 2 days, the world slowly tuned itself back into focus. The rustle of leaves became distinct. The distant drone of a fairy horn echoed across the water. The sound of my own footsteps on the hardwood floors was a rhythm I had forgotten I possessed. I made an appointment with my audiologist, Dr. Lena Petrova, a kind woman with gentle eyes. After a series of tests, she turned to me, her smile wide and genuine. "Cora," she said, and the sound of my own name, clear as a bell, was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. "It's remarkable. The nerve pathways, they've reopened. Your hearing is back." Almost completely. Relief washed over me, so potent it left me breathless. I can tell Daniel," I whispered, the sound of my own voice strange and new in my ears. "He'll be ecstatic," she said, patting my hand. I walked out of her office into the noisy, vibrant world. The screech of bus brakes, the chatter of people on the sidewalk, the cry of a gull overhead, it was a symphony, chaotic and overwhelming and glorious. I drove home, my heart pounding with the news I was about to share. This would fix it. This would fix us. The silence had been the wedge between us, and now it was gone. We could talk, we could laugh, we could find our way back. I walked into the house, my spirit soaring. I was about to call out his name when I heard their voices coming from the kitchen. Daniel and Margaret. I stopped at the foot of the staircase, my hand hovering over the banister, suddenly frozen by an instinct I couldn't name. I decided to wait, to listen for just a moment, to savor this secret for a few seconds more before sharing my joy. But what I heard was not joy. "I'm just tired of pretending, Mom," Daniel's voice drifted out, laced with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with caregiving. "She's like dead weight now. She can't hear a word, and honestly, it's peaceful." My heart didn't just drop, it shattered. The sound of his words, so clear, so casual, was a physical blow. Dead weight. I pressed my back against the cool plaster of the hallway wall, the portfolio I was carrying slipping from my numb fingers and landing silently on the rug. Margaret's voice, sharp and cold as ice, cut through the air. "Daniel, I told you from the start. She was never on your level. I begged you not to marry her." An hour ago, she had brought me a cup of tea, her hand on my shoulder, her expression one of feigned sympathy. The memory was a nauseating lurch in my stomach. "I know, Mom," Daniel sighed, a sound of weary resignation. But what was I supposed to do? Now I'm stuck. Think of the optics. People would crucify me if I left her while she's like this. Like this. As if I were a broken object, a project he had grown tired of. They thought I was still adrift in my sea of silence, but I was standing right there on the shore, hearing every single word. Each one was a shard of glass embedding itself in my heart. "I should have married Sophie when I had the chance," Daniel muttered, and that was the shard that went the deepest. All this time, I had been a placeholder. A convenient, quiet substitute for the life he really wanted. Margaret chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Well, let's not dwell on past mistakes. What about the money? Has she signed anything yet?" My breath caught in my throat. "What money? What are you talking about?" Daniel asked, his voice laced with confusion. "Her mother's estate, you fool." Margaret snapped, her patience gone. "The Saltwood house, the land, that bank account she hasn't touched since the funeral. You said she's still too sentimental to deal with it. Now is the perfect time. Get her to sign over power of attorney. If she's as deaf and disconnected as she seems, she won't even know what she's agreeing to." My mouth went dry. They weren't just dismissing me, they were actively plotting to steal from me. To take the last tangible piece of my mother, the home filled with her laughter and the scent of her gardens, the security she had worked her entire life to give me. I had told Daniel I wasn't ready to manage the estate, that the grief was still too raw. He had held me and said he understood, that I should take all the time I needed. And all along, he'd seen my grief not as a wound to be healed, but as an opportunity to be exploited. "She trusts you," Margaret's voice was a venomous whisper. She always has. Just put the papers in front of her, give her that sad, caring smile you do so well. She won't ask any questions. There was a pause. I held my breath, praying, pleading with a universe I no longer trusted, for him to say no. For a single shred of the man I loved to surface. I'll try, Daniel muttered. But if she puts up a fight, we'll need to think of another way. Another way. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken threats. My body went numb. The tears I thought would come simply didn't. My hands began to shake, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. I pressed them against my stomach, trying to hold myself together. The urge to storm in there, to scream, to shatter the smug, predatory piece of their conversation, was a roaring fire in my chest. But I didn't. A strange, cold clarity settled over me. Screaming would only give them the satisfaction of seeing me broken. My silence, the very thing they saw as my weakness, was now my greatest weapon. I turned, my steps deliberate and silent on the thick runner of the hallway. I retreated to the small guest room I had taken to sleeping in, a space that felt more mine than the marital bed now did. I closed the door softly and sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the wall. The world was no longer muffled by injury, but by the roaring in my ears, the sound of my life, as I knew it collapsing into dust. For weeks ago, I wouldn't have believed Daniel capable of a single unkind thought toward me. He was my protector, my partner, my best friend. He had held my hand in the dark, silent hospital room and promised me we would get through it together. Now I knew the truth. He wasn't trying to get me through it, he was profiting from it. The most terrifying part wasn't the cruelty of his words, but the calmness of his tone. Betraying me wasn't a struggle for him. It was a business decision. But they had made one critical miscalculation. They thought the woman in the guest room was still lost in the fog. They didn't know she could hear everything. And she would not forget. The grief came later that night, a silent, wrenching sob into a pillow so as not to make a sound. It was a hollowed-out, desolate sorrow, not just for the loss of my husband, but for the death of the woman I had been, the trusting, open-hearted woman who had believed in the goodness of the man she loved. When the tears finally subsided, they left behind not emptiness, but a hard, clear resolve. That woman was gone, and in her place stood someone else. Someone who had been tempered in silence and fire. For the next 3 days, I became a phantom performer in the theater of my own life. I was Ophelia, feigning a gentle madness, my silence my shield. I moved through the house with the same quiet, dependent air they had grown accustomed to. I would nod and offer a small, hesitant smile when Daniel spoke to me, my eyes fixed on his lips, pretending to struggle for meaning. I allowed Margaret to pat my head like a docile pet, accepting her cups of weak, bitter tea with a grateful dip of my head. I was playing the part of the broken woman they believed me to be, and they, in their arrogance, never once doubted the performance. Behind the mask, however, a new Cora was at work, methodical, precise, and utterly focused. My illustrator's eye, once used for capturing the beauty of the natural world, was now turned to a different subject, the anatomy of their deceit. The moment they left the house for one of their errands, a trip to the city for a leisurely lunch, leaving the dead weight behind, I sprang into action. I went straight to Daniel's study, the heart of their plotting. My mother had always warned me, the most important things are never just digital, Cora. Always keep a paper trail. Tucked away in the back of a filing cabinet, under a mislabeled folder titled Old Tax Receipts, I found them. Drafts of power of attorney documents. A financial statement from my mother's estate account that Daniel must have requested from her solicitor under false pretenses. There was even a property appraisal for the Saltwood house, dated just 2 weeks after my accident. My hands were steady as I took my phone and photographed every single page. I uploaded the images to a secure cloud drive, then emailed a password-protected file to a name I had found that morning, Isabel Reed, a partner at one of the city's most formidable family law firms, known for being as sharp as she was compassionate. Her bio said she specialized in cases of financial abuse and exploitation. The subject line of my email was simple: urgent consultation, evidence attached. Next, I retrieved the small, discreet digital audio recorder I had purchased from an electronics store across town, paying in cash. I had kept it in the pocket of my robe, a silent, constant companion. I pressed play, and their voices filled the quiet study, cold, clear, and damning. Daniel, honestly, it's peaceful. Margaret, get her to sign over power of attorney. She won't even know what she's agreeing to. Daniel, if she never hears again, I won't be upset. I saved the file, named it Betrayal, and uploaded it to the same secure drive. I made 3 separate backups on hidden USB drives, one of which I sealed in a waterproof bag and hid under a loose stone in the garden wall, a place only my mother and I had known. That evening, I did something that felt both surreal and empowering. I cooked. I made Daniel's favorite dish, a rich and creamy seafood linguine, with garlic bread toasted to golden perfection. I set the table with our best china and lit candles. I wanted to see them, to sit across from them in the warm glow of the candlelight, knowing what I knew. They were delighted. Daniel poured the wine, a deep, ruby red. Margaret toasted, her glass held high. To family, she said, her eyes glinting, and to a peaceful future. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. You're so quiet tonight, Cora, Daniel said, reaching across the table to cover my hand with his. His touch felt like a spider crawling on my skin. I had to force myself not to recoil. I looked at him, met his gaze, and gave him a small, sad smile, the one he expected. Just tired, I mouthed, then took a slow sip of water. He squeezed my hand. You're so strong. You'll get through this. I looked at the man before me, the man who had once traced the constellations on my back as we lay in the dark, the man who had whispered poems to me on rainy afternoons. He was gone. In his place sat a stranger, a hollow man with a charming smile and a heart full of larceny. And he had no idea that the woman sitting opposite him was not his victim, but his judge. He thought he was in control, but he had already lost everything. He just didn't know it yet. The next day, I packed a single suitcase with my most essential belongings, my journals, my mother's photograph, a few changes of clothes, and my most precious set of illustration pens. I booked a room at a boutique hotel in a quiet part of the city, using my maiden name, and paid for a week in advance with my personal credit card, an account Daniel knew nothing about. My new lawyer, Isabel Reed, called me back that afternoon. Her voice was calm and firm, with an undercurrent of steel. Ms. Shaw, she began, I've reviewed the documents and listened to the recording. I'm so sorry you're going through this. But from a legal standpoint, what you have is a cannon. Not a smoking gun, a cannon. We can put a stop to this immediately. A wave of relief so profound it made me dizzy washed over me. What do I do? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. You do nothing for now. Let them think their plan is working. I'm drafting temporary restraining orders and a formal notice of separation. We'll file them first thing Monday morning. When the time is right, you will leave. Do not confront them alone. Your safety is the priority. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, now his bedroom, and watched them. Daniel was asleep, his breathing deep and even. He looked peaceful, innocent. A stranger. I felt a pang of grief, not for him, but for the illusion I had loved so dearly. The beautiful, intricate drawing of our life together was a forgery, and I was only now seeing the clumsy, fraudulent lines beneath the paint. I backed away and closed the door on that life for the last time. Tomorrow I would speak, and the world they had built on my silence would crumble. The morning broke gray and damp, the sky the color of unpolished silver. Margaret had already left for an early appointment, leaving a lingering trail of her sharp perfume in the hall. Daniel was in the kitchen, sitting at the polished oak table where we had shared 1,000 breakfasts. He was scrolling through the news on his tablet, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands. He didn't look up when I entered. He had stopped looking up for me weeks ago. I walked over to the coffee pot and poured myself a mug, the clink of the ceramic against the counter unnervingly loud in the quiet room. I sat down opposite him. The air was thick with unspoken things, a storm gathering just off the coast. He finally glanced up from his screen, his practiced, concerned expression sliding into place. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, his lips forming the words with exaggerated care. "You sleep okay?" I nodded, taking a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth fortify me. I set the mug down gently on the table. Then I looked directly into his eyes, and I opened my mouth to speak, my own voice clear and steady in the silent house. "I heard everything, Daniel." Time stopped. The lazy Sunday morning atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a sudden, glacial tension. Daniel's face went utterly blank, a canvas wiped clean of all expression. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. No sound came out. He looked at me as if I had just sprouted wings. "I got my hearing back a week ago," I continued, my voice level, devoid of the hysteria he might have expected. "I wanted to wait. I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I wasn't listening. And now I know." He finally found his voice, a strangled, panicked whisper. "What?" "Cora, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about you and your mother in this very kitchen," I said, my gaze unwavering. "I'm talking about being dead weight. About how peaceful it is now that I can't hear. I'm talking about your plan to have me sign over my mother's house." He recoiled as if I had struck him. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. No, you've misunderstood. Cora, listen to me." "I have been listening," I cut him off, my voice rising with a cold fire I didn't know I possessed. "For days. Every whisper. Every scheme. Every lie." He took a step toward me, his hands outstretched in a pleading gesture. "Please. Don't touch me." The words were ice. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my fingers steady. I pressed play. His own voice filled the sunlit kitchen, a grotesque echo of his betrayal. "If she never hears again, I won't be upset. She's too naive to suspect anything." The color drained from his face. He looked at the phone in my hand as if it were a snake. You recorded me?" "Every word," I confirmed. "It's with my lawyer. Along with copies of the power of attorney documents you drafted, the illegal property appraisal, and a full statement of your attempts to manipulate me into signing away my inheritance." He sank back into his chair, the strength gone from his limbs, the weight of his own treachery finally crushing him. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. It wasn't remorse I saw in his face. It was the terror of being caught. Just then, the front door clicked open and Margaret breezed in, carrying a designer shopping bag and a coffee. "Daniel, darling, you'll never guess what I found at." Her voice trailed off as she took in the scene. My rigid posture, Daniel's ashen face. "What on earth is going on?" she demanded, her eyes narrowing at me. I turned to face her, my expression calm. "He knows," I said simply. "I know everything." Her perfectly made-up face tightened. She let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Don't be ridiculous. You're bluffing." I didn't say a word. I simply played the recording again, this time turning the phone so the sound was aimed directly at her. Her own sharp, conspiratorial voice filled the air. The smugness on her face curdled into pure, unadulterated shock. "You little," she started, taking a step toward me. "Careful, Margaret," I warned, my voice low and dangerous. "A restraining order has already been drafted. If either of you comes near me, my home, or my finances again, my lawyer will file it so fast it will make your head spin. Everything has been documented." They stared at me. Not at the wife, not at the daughter-in-law, but at a stranger. And in a way, I was. The woman they had underestimated, the woman they had plotted against while she sat in the same room, was gone. In her place was someone they had unwittingly created, someone who had learned the immense power of listening. I turned without another word and walked to the hallway, where my suitcase was waiting by the door. On my way, I passed the large, framed photograph from our wedding day. The two of us on a cliff overlooking the ocean, smiling, radiant with a love I now knew to be a lie. I paused, looking at the face of the hopeful, trusting girl I had been. I felt a pang of sadness for her, but no regret. I left the photograph on the wall. A monument to his deception. Let it haunt him. Daniel followed me onto the porch, his voice cracking with desperation. "Cora, please. Don't go. We can fix this. I made a terrible mistake. I love you." I stopped at the top of the steps and turned to face him one last time. The morning mist was burning off, and a sliver of sunlight broke through the clouds. "No, Daniel," I said, and my voice was gentle, not with forgiveness, but with the profound sadness of the truth. "You don't love me. You loved the idea of me. You loved the quiet. You loved the control. But you never, ever loved me." I walked down the steps and didn't look back. A discreet black car was waiting at the curb, exactly as Isabel had arranged. As the driver took my suitcase and opened the door for me, I felt the heavy weight I had been carrying for months begin to lift. The car pulled away from the curb, and I allowed myself one last glance in the rearview mirror. I saw him standing on the porch of the home he had tried to steal, a small, diminished figure, watching his carefully constructed world fall apart. I felt no triumph, no anger. Only a quiet, clean, and boundless sense of peace. The sun was fully out now, and its light streamed through the window, warm on my face. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't just surviving the silence. I was stepping into my own light, ready to hear the music of my own life begin again.